It was an ordinary, cold, and silent night when Lucas, the receptionist at the Atlas Motel, began his shift. The clock showed 10 p.m., and the place felt more isolated than ever. It was the kind of motel that always seemed off, as if time had stopped there, but Lucas never dwelled on it. Those tired walls and the corridors lined with old carpets were just part of the job. The motel was never busy, but tonight, something was different. There was a feeling in the air, an almost tangible tension that he couldn't quite put his finger on. The sound of the reception bell shattered the silence. Lucas glanced toward the door and saw a figure slowly entering. It was a middle-aged man with an odd smile and eyes that seemed distant, like he was somewhere else entirely, another time, another place. He looked at Lucas with an empty expression and said, in a voice that sounded like a faint whisper from far away, "Quiet night, isn't it?" Lucas forced a smile, trying to be polite. Something about the man made him uneasy, though he couldn't pinpoint what. He just felt it. "Yes, sir. We have rooms available. May I have your name, please?" The man handed over the key to an old suitcase he was carrying. But when Lucas looked at him again, he realized something was off. The man's eyes were fixed on some faraway spot, not really focusing on him, as if he wasn't actually there. Lucas blinked, trying to make sense of it. It didn't add up. The man seemed so empty. "My name is..." The man began, but his voice faltered. He looked at Lucas again, as though trying to recall something. "He doesn't know," he said, his lips moving soundlessly. That phrase echoed in Lucas's mind. What did he mean? Lucas glanced down at the guest log, trying to shake the increasing unease. Finally, the man muttered a name, disjointed and incomplete, but Lucas couldn't quite catch it. "One room for one night," Lucas said, retrieving a key from the file. When he handed it over, the man abruptly turned and left without another word. Lucas watched him walk down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in an almost rhythmic way. But there was something off about it. Each step sounded heavier than the last, as if the man were carrying an invisible burden. What was going on? Lucas tried to brush it off, but something deep inside told him that this night would be unlike any other. As the night went on, more guests arrived. A couple showed up shortly after. They moved in complete silence, like shadows, never making eye contact with Lucas. When the man handed over a credit card for payment, Lucas noticed his fingers. They were cold, almost inhumanly so. The couple's touch was icy, their eyes void of any life. They hurried off to their room, as though trying to escape something unseen. As the night dragged on, Lucas couldn't help but notice that the guests seemed increasingly strange. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared blankly ahead. What unnerved him most, however, was a feeling that they weren't there by chance. Something had drawn them to this place, something Lucas couldn't yet understand. He glanced at the guest records, hoping to distract himself from the growing unease. As he flipped through the pages, his eyes froze on a name that shouldn't have been there. The man who had arrived earlier, the one who uttered that strange phrase. His name wasn't recorded. Or rather, it was but the check-in and check-out dates were erased. None of it made sense. Heart pounding, Lucas stood from his chair and walked down the hallway. The silence in the motel was absolute, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger with every step. He looked at the doors to the rooms, each one shut tight, each one silent. Empty, or were they? Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And deep down, Lucas felt certain this would be the last night he saw the world the same way. The night seemed endless. Lucas was trapped in a loop of observing, and trying to dismiss the increasingly unsettling feelings. With each new guest that arrived, the strangeness only grew. He kept himself busy logging arrivals and departures, but his eyes frequently darted toward the motel's dark, silent hallways. Around 2 a.m., a woman walked in. She was tall and thin, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, despite the near-total darkness outside. She didn't look directly at Lucas as she approached the desk. Instead, she extended her hand and placed an envelope on the counter. Her movement was so precise, so mechanical, that Lucas felt a wave of discomfort crawl down his spine. "For room 23, please," she said in a monotone, emotionless voice. Without a word, Lucas grabbed the key and handed it to her. But just as she turned to leave, something even stranger happened. She stopped, turned back, and with a forced smile, whispered, "Have you ever heard the motel's voices?" Lucas froze. He didn't know what to say. Her smile didn't feel genuine, more like an attempt to maintain a facade. It was as if she were playing a game, but he didn't know the rules. "No, I don't know what you mean," he stammered awkwardly. She stared at him for a few more seconds, then gave a short nod and walked down the hallway. Lucas felt a chill run through him. The motel's voices. What did she mean by that? He was starting to feel paranoid, but the strange occurrences kept piling up. At one point, he thought he heard something, a distant sound like muffled laughter. He got up and peered into hallways, but no one was there. The lights flickered faintly, and all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, pounding harder and harder. Shortly after, another person walked in. A man dressed in worn-out clothes, his gaze vacant and his hair disheveled. He moved with an unsettling calm, as if he were somewhere else, detached from reality. As he approached the reception desk, Lucas noticed what looked like a drop of blood at the tip of his finger. The man seemed unaware or unconcerned about the blood staining his shirt. "A room, please," the man said in a low, muffled voice, as if speaking to himself. Lucas handed him a key for room 17. But before the man walked away, he suddenly turned, as though he had just remembered something. "It's so quiet here, isn't it?" he said, more as a statement than a question. "But have you heard the footsteps?" The receptionist froze, unsure how to respond. "Footsteps?" he tried to ask, but the man had already turned and walked away, leaving Lucas once again with that strange, unsettling feeling. The man disappeared into the hallway, but for a brief moment, Lucas could have sworn he heard something. Footsteps. Footsteps that weren't his own. The night dragged on. With each new guest, Lucas noticed more peculiarities. The forced smiles, the vacant expressions, the disjointed movements. It was as if everyone there was waiting for something. But what? He didn't know, and the air felt heavier with a tension he could no longer ignore. As he sat back down to check the records, his eyes stopped on a name he didn't recognize. Raoul Van Agus. He flipped through the pages, searching for more information about the guest, but there was nothing. No check-in date, no check-out date, not even an ID number. The name was there, but it didn't make sense. Something was wrong, and the harder he tried to make sense of it, the more he felt himself being drawn into a web of mysteries he couldn't escape. Suddenly, a sharp noise from the hallway made him jump. It was a distinct crack, like something breaking. He looked toward the door and heard it again, those faint, muffled giggles. Lucas stood, his body tense, his stomach in knots. He took cautious steps into the hallway, where the darkness seemed to swallow everything. But as he reached the end of the corridor, the sound stopped. Everything fell silent again. When he returned to the reception desk, something was different. The guest records were out of order, as if someone had been rifling through them. Once more, the name Raoul Van Agus stood out, but now it was accompanied by a date. A strange, impossible date. Never. Lucas swallowed hard. He couldn't make sense of what was happening anymore. He was starting to wonder if he was losing his mind, but the feeling of being watched, of something about to happen, just wouldn't go away. Something was wrong with this place. Something was happening here, and he didn't know if he'd survive long enough to figure out what it was. The clock struck 4 a.m. when Lucas, already exhausted, decided he couldn't ignore the strangeness of the night any longer. His eyes were heavy, his mind clouded with confusion, and his nerves completely on edge. He glanced at the empty office. Papers scattered across the desk, and a shiver ran down his spine. Something was about to happen, something much darker than he could have imagined. He got up from his chair and, with hesitant steps, made his way to the hallway. The air felt thick, as if time itself was heavy and oppressive. The silence was deafening, but the feeling that something unnatural lingered within those walls was impossible to ignore. As he walked, he stopped in front of room 23, the room where the woman with the dark glasses had gone earlier. He remembered her vacant stare, the way she seemed disconnected from reality. That question she'd asked, about the voices in the motel, still echoed in his mind unanswered. He reached out and touched the door, but there was no sound from the other side. He hesitated for a moment, then, without thinking, opened it. The room was empty. The beds were neatly made, but something about the atmosphere felt off. There was a faint, sweet smell, almost as if the air was laced with something unrecognizable. He walked to the center of the room, his breathing growing shallow as his eyes locked onto the dirty mirror on the wall ahead. Suddenly, a sharp crack shattered the silence. Lucas spun around quickly, but there was no one there. The sound seemed to have come from the far end of the hallway. He quickly shut the door to room 23 and, without thinking, headed in the direction of the noise. His steps were hurried but cautious. Something inside him screamed that this was serious. He stopped at the corner of the hallway, standing before a staircase that led down to the basement. The lights below flickered sporadically, as if the electricity was about to give out at any moment. But what froze him in place was a sound. Footsteps, but not the kind you'd expect from a guest or even a person. They were dragging heavy, as if something was approaching, but without any rush. Curiosity pushed Lucas forward, and he began descending the stairs. Each step echoed louder than the last, and the air grew colder and damp. When he finally reached the bottom step, the sight before him made him stop dead in his tracks. The basement was filled with boxes and stacked furniture, but something in the center of the room caught his attention. It was a figure, an indistinct silhouette, as if it were made of dense shadows with no defined shape. It was like the darkness itself had come alive, writhing in the farthest corner. He couldn't make out any clear details, but he could feel its presence, something there watching him. Suddenly, the figure moved, not in a natural way. It was more like a shift in perspective, as if it were twisting and warping, trying to take the shape of a human, but grotesquely distorted. Lucas took an involuntary step back, his body freezing for the first time that night. A faint, almost inaudible laugh drifted toward him, chilling his spine. And then, for a brief moment, he heard a single word, Raul. He didn't know where it came from, but he could feel it was meant for him. The figure contorted further, as if struggling to solidify, to transform into something more real. The sense of danger escalated rapidly. With his heart pounding, Lucas turned and bolted for the stairs. He didn't dare look back. The fear now consuming him made it feel as though the darkness was right behind him, just inches away from grabbing him. When he reached the hallway, the motel felt different, darker, more oppressive. The flickering lights were now completely out, draping everything in a suffocating blackness. The muffled voices and faint laughter that had lingered earlier were now unmistakable, emanating from every corner. They weren't human. He stumbled toward the reception desk, the pressure in his mind growing unbearable with each step. The realization hit him like a brick. This place was cursed. He knew that now. But before he could reach the desk, the sound of footsteps stopped him dead in his tracks. A man stood in front of him, Raul, but he wasn't the same as before. His eyes were pitch black, void of any pupils, and he grinned a wide, menacing grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally. "You'll never leave this place," Raul said, his voice unervingly inhuman. "Not now." Not after what you've seen. Lucas staggered backward, his back slamming against the wall. Raul didn't move, but his presence was suffocating. Slowly, Raul began walking toward him, his grin unchanging. The laughter returned, louder this time, joined by countless others, a cacophony of voices that filled the hallway like a sinister choir. And then, everything went black. Lucas woke up with a strangled scream caught in his throat. Tears streamed down his face as he was engulfed by total darkness. He tried to move, but the crushing weight of fear and the sensation of being trapped pinned him in place. Each breath felt heavier than the last, his chest tightening with every inhale. His head pounded, as though it were caught in the grip of something unseen and monstrous. He forced his eyes open, but the darkness remained relentless. He couldn't tell where he was or how he'd ended up there. Then, a faint noise caught his attention, a whisper, distant but distinctly audible. He strained to listen. The voices, and then the laughter returned. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just mocking. It was speaking, murmuring words in an almost imperceptible tone. Lucas forced his eyes to adjust, blinking rapidly in the oppressive blackness. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the void. But what he saw was more horrifying than anything he could have ever imagined. The room, or whatever that place was covered in strange symbols, marks etched into the walls like desperate scrawlings. The shapes in the space twisted in the shadows, grotesque and barely recognizable. Lucas couldn't tell if it was real or just a hallucination, but the voices persisted, clearer now, closer. Raul, Raul, Raul. The voices chanted his name over and over like a mantra. Lucas scanned the corners of the room, trying to locate the source of the sound, but all he found was more darkness and more laughter. Then a heavy noise echoed through the air, like something large and ancient being dragged across the ground. Lucas tried to stand, but his body refused to obey. He could feel eyes on him, lurking behind every shadow. It was as if the entire place was alive, the walls breathing around him. The air was thick, oppressive, and suffocating. Finally, his eyes focused forward. A figure emerged from the darkness. Raul. But he wasn't human anymore. He looked like a fusion of countless entities, his body a writhing mass of shadows, distorted shapes, and fragments of faces overlapping and colliding. His grin was still there, but now it was a thing of its own, a gaping, unnatural fissure carved into Raul's face. "You're finally seeing." Raul's voice came as a muffled whisper, yet it echoed from everywhere at once. "What happened here? It's inside you now. You can't leave anymore." Raul's words reverberated through Lucas's mind, but their meaning eluded him. What did he mean by inside you? Before Lucas could make sense of it, Raul stepped closer. A wave of heat washed over him, distorting reality itself. The room began to collapse, or maybe it was Lucas's perception that was breaking. The walls seemed to pull away, stretching outward as if the space itself was expanding into something incomprehensible. The sound of laughter grew louder, now mingled with cries, muffled screams, and low moans. An unbearable pressure weighed on his chest, as though an invisible force was crushing him, and his breathing turned ragged. What was happening? He had no idea. It felt as if reality was unraveling, dissolving into something beyond his grasp. Suddenly, he found himself standing in the middle of an infinite corridor. The doors lining the walls were locked, and the hallways stretched endlessly in both directions. The laughter, those insidious, haunting laughs, echoed all around him. They were in his head, in his body, and in the vast emptiness surrounding him. He was losing his grip on sanity. He could feel it slipping away. Then he heard it again. Footsteps, slow and dragging. But this time, it wasn't Raul. It wasn't human. He whipped around toward the source of the sound and saw another guest. A man, pale as death, his eyes empty and lifeless. His face was grotesquely disfigured, in a way Lucas couldn't even begin to describe. His feet were coated in something viscous, oozing up from the floor, and his movements were erratic, like a puppet being controlled by some unseen force. The man moved closer slowly, his empty gaze locked onto Lucas. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't human. It was a mix of voices, one layered over the other, as if the man had been overtaken by multiple entities. "You saw what happened. You saw what we are now." The distorted voice echoed, as if Lucas was hearing it through a resonance box. Lucas tried to pull away, but the ground seemed to keep his feet glued to the floor. He felt an invisible force holding his body, preventing him from moving. He was trapped, and the laughter, the screams, the voices of Raul, everything was blending into one unbearable sound. Before he could react, the man lunged forward, and Lucas felt a searing pain in his head, like something was invading his mind. An insane pressure, a silent scream that made his eyes widen and his body contort in agony. He tried to scream, but his mouth was sealed shut as if someone had locked it. And then everything went white. Lucas woke up in a different place. He couldn't say how or why, but he was back in the motel lobby. But it wasn't the same place he had known. The atmosphere was distorted. The walls seemed to pulse as if something alive was inside them, breathing slowly like an organism beyond comprehension. The weak, uncertain light cast huge, shifting shadows that moved with a life of their own, projecting strange shapes on the floor. The sound of muffled, discordant laughter echoed in the background, as if a crowd was waiting, watching him. The air was thick, almost suffocating. He tried to move, but his feet felt stuck to the floor. The fear grew stronger, but something inside him pushed him to keep going, to search for an exit that he no longer knew existed. It felt like time had warped. He didn't know how long he had been there. Hours, days, or just minutes. His sense of time had vanished, and the only sign of his sanity was the desperate need to escape. He looked around, trying to find something familiar, but nothing made sense. The reception tables were upside down. The chairs were twisted, and the phone that used to hang on the wall now seemed to stretch toward the floor, as if it had been pulled by an invisible force. The pictures on the walls were distorted, and some images seemed to move slowly, as if they wanted to slip out of their frames. And then he heard a voice, soft, almost whispering, coming from a dark corner of the lobby. He turned his head, and there, in the distance, where the light barely reached, was a figure. A woman with long, dark hair, wearing old-fashioned clothes, a dress that seemed to be from another time. She stood there, motionless, like a statue, but her eyes were locked on Lucas. They were black, completely black, and they glowed in a supernatural way, as if reflecting the darkness around her. "You shouldn't have come this far," the woman said, her voice soft but carrying an authority that made Lucas shudder. "This place doesn't let anyone leave. There's no escape anymore." Lucas tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, and he felt as if something was suffocating him, as though he were trapped in an invisible prison. He wanted to run, but the ground seemed to swallow him with every step, as if it were made of something more macabre and strange. The woman took a step toward him, and with the movement, the shadows around her stirred, as if they had a life of their own. Her eyes never left his, and she continued, "You see, Lucas, you're already lost. Everyone who comes here, in the end, becomes a part of it. The motel, the souls you see, they're not like you. They're gone. And now they're here, trapped between the walls, waiting for those who can continue what was started." The woman raised a hand, pointing toward the end of the hallway. A door opened abruptly, revealing what seemed to be a dark, empty room. But something was there, something that made the temperature drop and the air turn unbearably cold. "Go in," she whispered, her tone almost gentle but filled with something sinister. "I'll show you what hides behind the last door. What happens to those who can't escape." Lucas stared at the door, terror consuming him. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to flee, but his legs were frozen, as if they were glued to the floor. He knew, in some way, he was trapped in a distorted reality, that this woman wasn't just another guest. and that everything happening here was beyond his understanding. He had no choice anymore. An irrational impulse led him to move toward the door. With a hesitant step, he crossed the threshold. The air inside was even thicker, and a sense of oppression filled his chest. The silence was absolute, but the smell of mold and decay was unmistakable. When his eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, he saw what lay before him. It was a wall, but not just any wall. It was covered in images of distorted faces, mutilated bodies, human shadows that seemed to writhe and move. Each face wore an expression of eternal suffering, and their eyes, though painted, seemed to stare directly at him, as if they were alive. He stepped back, terror taking hold of him. But what stopped him was a figure that emerged from the images. Raul. But it wasn't just him. It was a version of him that seemed to be merging with the shadows around him. His eyes were completely black, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. "You've come too far, Lucas," Raul said, his voice echoing through the walls in a distorted way. "Now you understand. There's no turning back. You're one of them now." Before Lucas could react, an invisible force shoved him against the wall. The sensation of being swallowed by the shadows was terrifying. He tried to fight, to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. Fear completely consumed him. The images on the walls moved faster, as if he were being pulled into them. And in the background, he heard it again, the laughter, the same laughter that had haunted him from the beginning. And then, darkness swallowed him whole. Lucas woke up again, but now, he was no longer in the motel. Or at least, he didn't recognize the place. He was in a cold, sterile room, where the walls were made of rough concrete, and the air smelled of mold and despair. He felt weak, as if he lacked the strength to even move. His eyes were heavy, as if exhaustion had overtaken his body. But fear still kept him alert, his heart racing uncontrollably. When he tried to move, he realized he was trapped. Not physically, but in a more insidious way, as though the shadows around him had imprisoned him. He looked toward the corners of the room and saw something that froze him in place. The walls were covered in faces. Faces he recognized. Each one was distorted in a grotesque way, their empty eyes fixed, as if they were pleading for help. And among those faces, there was Raul's. But he wasn't smiling anymore. His face was twisted in a grimace of pain and suffering, his eyes dull, as if he were seeing something beyond Lucas. Before he could process what he was seeing, Raul's voice echoed, clear and cold. "You can't run anymore, Lucas. You've reached the end of the line. Now, you understand what happens to those who lose themselves in the game. We're all part of it now." Lucas tried to scream, but his throat felt tight. The words wouldn't come. He felt a pressure on his chest, as if the reality around him was closing in. Fear was consuming him. But he knew he had to understand what was happening. He needed to know the truth. He looked around and, with effort, forced his muscles to move, dragging himself toward the nearest wall. His fingers touched the cold surface, and soon he realized what the images on the walls represented. They weren't just faces. They were the faces of every guest who had passed through that motel. And at some point, he saw himself there too, with the same empty eyes and the same expression of eternal suffering. The door to the room opened, and the woman he had seen earlier entered. Her cold, unblinking gaze left no doubt that she knew exactly what was happening. She didn't speak, but her eyes conveyed a clear message. He had been consumed by the cycle. He was part of the motel now, just like all those before him. "You're no longer Lucas," she said, her voice seeming to come from another world. "Now, you're just another lost soul, another shadow that haunts this place. All who enter here become part of something we can't understand. They disappear, but they never leave. We are the guardians of the motel, prisoners of what happened here." Lucas tried to resist, trying to make sense of what she was saying, but the words didn't make any sense. He felt like he was sinking into something he couldn't escape. He wanted to scream, run, do anything to get out of that place, but his movements were growing heavier, slower. The feeling of being consumed, swallowed by the darkness, was overwhelming. "You see," she continued, "there is no end for us. We are the souls that remain, those trapped between time and space. And you, Lucas, you've become one of them. Now, the cycle repeats. You are now a receptionist. You are now a guest. You are now part of the motel." Before he could respond, the room began to disintegrate. The walls crumbled. The faces and the images started to scream, but the sounds distorted in ways Lucas couldn't understand anymore. The darkness grew, and he knew he was losing control. He was disappearing. He tried to fight, but his very identity was dissolving. He no longer knew who he was. When the silence finally fell, he found himself back at the motel reception. His body was there, but something was wrong. He was no longer Lucas. He was no longer human. He felt it, the change. Time was frozen, and the motel was his prison now. He had become a part of that place, lost among the walls and the faces that could never be erased. He looked toward the entrance door and saw more guests arriving, strange, distorted, with the same empty eyes. They entered, but they never left. It was like the cycle was repeating, as if it had never truly ended. And now, he was there, part of the cycle, waiting for the next. Lucas looked into the mirror behind the reception desk and saw something that made him shudder. His reflection was there, but it wasn't him anymore. It was a hollow being, soulless, just a shadow of what he once was. He was lost, forever,